This podcast is kindly sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Today we're interviewing Stephen Walker. This is part 1 of part 2. All right. Stephen Walker, thanks for joining us. I'm going to jump into the questions immediately. Can you tell me, what is it like winning awards?
What is it like winning awards? I think the most extraordinary example of winning an award was actually winning an award for something I never expected to win an award for at all. If you think you're up for something, then it's a completely different thing. I mean, of course, the obvious thing that people will say is, oh, it doesn't matter, who cares, you know, it's not important. And of course, that's probably not always. It's a little disingenuous because people do care. And most people care anyway. But I do remember years ago, when this film I made called Young at Heart, which is about these old people who sing rock music, actually a film that is now being developed potentially as a Broadway musical, which is quite interesting. When that film was at the Los Angeles Film Festival and it won the Audience Award there, we had no idea that we'd won it. And we were shoved in a taxi by our agent at William Morris in Los Angeles, who then drove us to this auditorium in which there must have been over 1,500 people, maybe even 2,000 people. Hollywood's great and good. And we were just sort of ushered onto a stage and suddenly told that we literally, as we were ushered onto the stage, to be told that we'd won the LA Film Festival Audience Award. And the whole, I remember, audience sort of stood up and had absolutely no idea what was going on whatsoever. And the only thing I could think of to say in this speech was, because we'd taken this taxi with our sales agent from William Morris to get to this place quickly, the only thing I could think of to say was, has anybody got any money for a taxi? Because I got a taxi waiting outside the auditorium. It was that, I was like a startled rabbit, you know, with headlights on. And it was an amazing thing to have, but it was utterly unexpected. And maybe that's the best way, you know.
A while back, you I think you did your master's at Harvard and you studied history.
Yeah.
Did that shape you? How did that shape you?
Gosh, I don't know. It's such a long time ago. I read history actually at Oxford originally, and that was a fantastic training. And it's an amazing training, actually, but I'm very privileged in that respect. I mean, it's a constant tutorial essay-based system, and it does teach you very quickly to sort of formalize thoughts and to get to the nub of something as quickly as you possibly can, which is good. And that has a variety of uses. At Harvard, I studied philosophy and the history of science, which is slightly different. So some of those historical tools really help, but also I put it together with the science and the story of science over the centuries, which was fascinating. And that's always remained a real interest for me. So I suppose it has two kind of consequences. One is a disciplinary one, because you are learning how to think, which is really important. And the other one is an actual fascination with the subject itself, which has come back in various kind of projects that I've done ever since. But I can remember back then, even while I was at Harvard, actually, I worked for a radio station. In fact, I was an announcer, I was a DJ at a radio station called WHRB in Boston, which was fun, and then ended up going to New York City and working in a radio station there, talk radio station there, which was great fun. So I always had that kind of media interest. And I can remember, it's a long time ago now, I was doing a PhD course actually at Harvard, and I can remember that the idea of sticking it out as an academic for several years and then trying to get a fellowship or the equivalent of a professorship or an assistant professorship seemed to be just endless. You know, it was an endless cycle of years coming up ahead, and I wanted to get on with my life. I had a great friend of mine who was actually an old friend from Oxford who had got into the BBC and was working on a history series called Time Watch on the BBC, and seemed to be having a lot of fun. He was traveling around all over the place. It was kind of glory days at the BBC. And I thought, maybe I will give it a go and try and get into the BBC. So that was the trajectory, if you like. That's how the whole thing sort of started. So it could have been a fork in the road. It was a fork in the road. It could have been an academic course and an academic life, or it could have been what it ended up being, a life essentially in the media, I suppose you can call it. So
Did you study hard? What was your social life like at uni?
I was very oddly and quite coincidentally, I was at a drinks party last night, which was given by the provost of my college in Oxford, and it was in London. It was in a very beautiful house actually in London. And there were quite a few people in my generation, because my year was the first year where women were accepted actually in my particular college in Oxford. And it was actually lovely seeing these people again and reminding me of the fun that we had there. I mean, did we work hard? It's funny. I mean, a lot of people, I suppose it was a different time. I mean, it was a different time, obviously. And maybe things were laxer or easier. I did a lot of theatre. I acted quite a lot. Um, and that's rather wonderful, actually. It was fun doing those things. I was having supper a few days ago with a friend of mine who's just won a BAFTA, actually, who I first acted with. I mean, he stayed an actor and he's on The Archers and all sorts of things now. But we go right back to that time. And I love that sort of connection that goes over the generations, over the years. So acting was fun. Partying was fun. I did quite a bit of journalism, if I remember. I'm sure I got drunk a lot. I do remember working quite hard, but I wasn't a kind of a library hack, as we called it. I didn't spend.
Were you a womanizer?
Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. I'm an old hag now, so how can we possibly remember those things? I doubt it very much. I mean, I had girlfriends. Very dangerous things to ask, Richard. We have to be serious. This is for Camera Club, isn't it?
The Camera Museum.
Camera Museum. That's it.
And others. So then you went into the BBC and you stayed there for a few years. What did you learn? What did you contribute to? Were there any memorable moments? After
I entered the BBC in a rather kind of, there still is, in fact, it still exists. There was a graduate training course there, which was called let me just say, it was called the graduate, what was it called? I can't remember, production trainee course, that's what it's called. It was supposed to be quite competitive. And I came over from America, actually, when I was still at Harvard, actually, and I came over for two what they call boards, which were interviews, which were very, very, very intimidating, particularly the second one. I mean, it was a really intimidating, I mean, unbelievably intimidating interviews where you were with very major people in the BBC, and there's nothing but, a stout oak table between you. It was kind of scary, but it was exciting. And amazingly, they were stupid enough to give me this traineeship, and it was a 2-year traineeship. And the way it worked was quite extraordinary, because they did sort of 3 months of training, and then we were all kind of thrown out to different, what they called attachments, for 3 months each. I ended up going to Leeds for the first 3 months. I went to Belfast, right in the middle of a really quite bad time in Belfast. And I lived with a news journalist there called David Shookman, who was a reporter until very recently at the BBC. And I also did drama, and and it was really good fun. I did get into terrible trouble, actually. I got into really, really terrible trouble. I can remember being on a drama shoot as an absolute junior of a junior, aged 23, 24 years old, something like that. And it was out in the country somewhere. It was in a stately home. It was actually it was Ben Kingsley was in it, I think. It was Silas Marner, the adaptation of George Eliot's Silas Marner for the BBC, which became quite a celebrated program. And we were out there, and in those days, there were no mobile phones. They used to use Motorola's, walkie-talkies to communicate. And this is possibly a crew of about 200 people on this set. And I can remember I was in charge of all of these Motorola's. That was my job. And at the end of each day, I had to collect them together, put them in the boot of the car, and drive off to my pretty shitty hotel in the morning, come back. Basically, that's what I did all day long. And I got kind of arrogant and frustrated, because I was thinking, I want to do more than this. I want to see what's going on. I want to be at the heart of the action, all of that stuff. So when it came to the Saturday of this shoot, I've been on for about 4 or 5 days, I just thought, fuck this. And I got in my car and drove to London to go to a party, actually, forgetting that I had the entire complement of Motorola walkie-talkies still in the boot of my car. So there was absolutely no way any of these 200 people could communicate with each other over the course of the weekend. And I got into such trouble when I turned up on a Monday morning. I remember, I thought it was all quite funny, but I remember being called up to the head of the drama department and being told that my career in television was over from that moment. But of course it wasn't. And they say things like that. And they couldn't fire me anyway because I was on this 2-year traineeship, and I just moved on to somewhere else. So I got away with it. But it did also teach me a lesson about, you know, make sure you know what's in your car on a Saturday if you're about to leave a set. Check the boot.
How was the party?
I can't remember. Probably quite good fun.
And do you remember the question, one question that the BBC panel asked you during your recruitment?
Gosh, it was not really very well. No, I do remember, though, that one of the things we had to do was we sat downstairs in a little room, and they had what was there, I mean, God, I'm showing my age here, a typewriter. And next to the typewriter was a cardboard folder. And we were not told what was in the cardboard folder. You went in one by one, and you were given 20 minutes. And it was timed. And you were told at the point of 0, just as the clock starts, you would open that folder and you would see a sheaf of newspaper cuttings in there, which could be about an individual or it could be about something. And you had to write an article for the Today Show, the Radio 4's Today Show. You had to write a piece that would be read by the reporter of the morning, as if that was a piece of news. And in my case, it was an obituary, I seem to remember, of Paul McCartney. So I was given a sheath of newspaper cuttings about Paul McCartney, and the assumption was he just died. And I had to write the obituary, and you're given 20 minutes. And I remember there was a porter. It was a bit kind of weird, this. There was a porter who came in to stop you wherever your fingers were on that typewriter at that point. So 20 minutes. And then that was then taken upstairs to the board, and they would then read it, and then they would quiz you on it. And it was quite frightening. In some ways, my training at university really helped there because you have to be really fast. But you've got to actually open all these things, read through enough of them, get the salient facts, sit down and write whatever it was, 500 words, 1,000 words, probably about 500 words, I seem to remember, of coherent radio speak that could have been used in the Radio 4 show, the Today Show, that day. That was fun.
Wow. Fast forward a few years. You decide to leave the BBC, is that correct?
I stayed in the BBC for, gosh, I can't remember. I made a lot of films at the BBC. I stayed there until the late end of the 90s, yeah. And then I went freelance. And then I set up my own company after that.
You must have directed lots of non-fiction, is that correct?
Yeah,
BBC?
and fiction too, yeah. I did fiction too. I did one extraordinarily interesting one, actually, drama, which was remade into a movie with Colin Firth much more recently, but I did it with John Hurt. So it was called The Railway Man. It was an extraordinary story, true story by a man called Eric Lomax, who had been working, who'd been a prisoner of war. He was captured in Singapore in 1942, was a prisoner of war of the Japanese, and worked on the famous Thai-Burma Railway, bridge over the River Kwai Railway. And it was an amazing, amazing story in which he, many, many years later, finds the man that tortured him. This is true. And tracked him down to kill him. And we told that story. It was called Prisoners in Time. And it was an extraordinary experience. So John Hurt was the kind of principal actor who played Eric Lomax. I was terrified when I first met him. He's a formidable, he's dead now, sadly. He was a formidable actor, but he also had a formidable reputation for alcoholism as well. And that was problematic for us because I can remember filming, had a big crew, and we were in Thailand. I was only, 34 at the time. And we were in Thailand and we were filming in the middle of the jungle. And we had got from a very, very, very high level source, we'd actually managed to secure a train with 3 carriages that would take us right over the original Thai Burma Railway, and we'd film on that train. Got a load of extras that came in from Bangkok. And we had this scene where John Hurt had to do just one thing, which was to look out of the window and see this landscape evolving from the train, which was the landscape that he'd been a prisoner in back in 1942. This is all part of his search for this guy that had tortured him. And all those memories kind of come flooding back. The problem is that on the day, John got completely drunk. And he, seriously completely drunk. And I got caught, I remember, by my head of costume who was in the train, another part of the train, saying, Steve, we've got a real problem because John can't stand up. And this was the one chance we had this bloody train. And I can remember going back to find John sitting there slumped on the seat and saying, dear boy, this is such a moving story and all this sort of stuff. And I realized we were in really deep shit. So we had a sound recordist who looked from the back a bit like John Hurt, had the same kind of size. We dressed him up in his costume. We did every shot we possibly could from behind that was actually the sound recordist. But there was one shot which we desperately needed John for. All he had to do was look out of this window with a camera that was going to be looking right down the length of the railway, right down the length of the train. And as the train came round this bend with mountains and river and jungle, this absolute kind of David Lean moment, this incredible shot would reveal itself. So the train becomes the dolly, basically. I had a wonderful DP who had the camera, sadly passed away now, who had his camera fixed on the side of the train, shooting this on film. And we were looking down the length of the train, and we had 6 people holding John Hurt up on the inside with his head peering through the open window just to keep him actually standing. And because he was slightly kind of glazed with alcoholism, it actually looked great. And I can remember my director of photography looking up and saying, this is a fantastic shot. He looks really, he's back in the moment. It's wonderful, and the landscape and the jungle and all that. And this thing is coming around and coming around. And suddenly, to my horror, I noticed that John's head started to slump. And it slumped and it slumped and it slumped. And then he vomited all over the side of the train. And that was my $1 million shot. Fucked, totally fucked. And I can remember sitting in the cutting room with my wonderful editor and thinking, what do we do? How do we get around this? What do we do? And we came up with a wonderful idea. I can't remember whose idea it was, probably his, not mine. And what we did was we took the shot as long as possible, just to the frame before his head started to slump, literally to the frame before his head started to slump. And we then cut to these incredible images in black and white of Japanese prisoners of war, who are British prisoners of war of the Japanese, working on that very same section of the railway, thin, broken, battered, starving. And it just came across the cut. And it looks like it was always meant to be that way. And it was an amazingly powerful moment. I mean, I remember sitting with audiences watching it at various kinds of festivals and things, and it was a startling moment. And it all happened because John was vomiting. And somehow that made you, it's that wonderful thing where you have to think there has to be a way around this. There has to be a way to make this work. And in fact, the way you make it work is actually rather better. And film has so many examples of that. Not mine, I mean, generally, of how when you're up against the wall or the budgets are tight or something goes wrong, something incredible happens that is the film and the thing that people remember, you know?
That's interesting. Back in the BBC, did you have to cultivate relationships in order to get work? Was there a lot of competition? What was your take on things back then?
Yeah, I mean, the BBC is both I was very lucky. I grew up in the BBC at a time when the BBC was very different, obviously, from what it is now. I mean, I'm not one of those people who sit there and go, oh God, the good old days. Because I look forward, I didn't look backwards, which is why I find this sort of thing quite entertaining, but also quite difficult in some ways to remember. It all seems long ago now. I think that, like any organization, there's going to be competition and there's going to be all of those things, and definitely there was, but it was a sort of very comfortable atmosphere then. Budgets were were fairly generous. I remember the business of getting commissions. I mean, the contrast between getting commissions as an independent producer and getting commissions as a staff member of the BBC back in the 1990s is it's two different worlds. I mean, you would come up with an idea, you'd walk into your series producer's office, you'd say, look, whoever it was, I've got a fantastic idea about X, what do you think? By then, hopefully, you've established enough of a reputation for people to take a punt on you, and you walk out quite often with a commission. By the next day, you're putting a budget together. By the day after that, you've got a team, usually the same team you have from the last project, and you're on your way. So it was an incredibly privileged time. I mean, it just is a world away from what happens now. There's just no parallels whatsoever between then and now. That process is now a minefield. It is filled with obstacles, with challenges, with difficulties. I mean, it's a whole other ballgame. It really, really is. You know, and for example, for some companies like ITV, for instance, you actually have to raise the money with a bank loan from Barclays or something, and then they pay you back at the end, and that gives you, there's masses of risk involved with that. It's just a totally different ballgame. This was much more, all of these organizations are centered on human relationships. Of course they are. I mean, that's kind of the, bog obvious. But the intimacy of that situation, the kind of hugger-mugger intimacy of it, was what made quite a big difference and what made it a delight to work in. And of course, you have to understand, we were working in a building which had several departments in. We had documentaries in there, we had music and arts in there, we had all sorts of things. And sport was in there, the cutting rooms were in there, the canteen was an incredible place, because quite apart from seeing kind of actors dressed up as kind of Nazis or Roman soldiers having kind of pasta, you would also have the opportunity to sit opposite the table, and people would say, I'm having a real issue with something in my, come and have a look after lunch. Would you pop down to my cutting room and have a look inside? I just, I've got this slightly knotty. So you'd spend an hour with a friend and their editor in a cutting room, and you'd watch a section or a sequence in a film, and you might come up with some, what you hope would be helpful suggestions, and then you go back to your office. That world has utterly and totally disappeared. Totally. I mean, it really has gone. And so, and that's sad in a way, because, but it was built on privilege to a certain extent. It was built on money, and it was a very, very different television culture, because of course it wasn't faced with the explosion of competition, of information, of alternative claims on attention, if you like, that exists.
What's it like pitching today? Can you give
us?
us?
I do much less of it now, because what I tend to do more is, I mean, most of my projects now are books that I've written and films that I've made, which are being turned into movies. So I work with companies like Working Title Films, for example, which is obviously a very major production company that makes a lot of big feature films. And I tend to work with them developing projects, which are projects of mine that could be based on books or ideas I've had or whatever. So that tends to be more than I'm doing. So mine is very much based on relationships. So for example, at Working Title, I know some people there, and because I know those people and they know me and we have those relationships, it's actually not that difficult in that respect. But so I don't tend to go into, I'm not out there pitching to, commissioning editors at Channel 4 or whatever anymore. I stopped doing that a few years back. I think I got to a point really where I felt tired of it. I felt that what was happening was that the process of setting up projects was becoming so laborious that it was beginning to get boring. And obviously one has to earn money, but it was beginning to get sort of boring, and I was finding it unrewarding. And I think you get to a point in life where you think, well, okay, then what, I like to be creative. I don't want to lose those juices. Where do I put it instead? So I tended to put it much more in writing, and then developing those projects, if I can, into movies, rather than going and doing the kind of the sales pitch to make the new documentary series about whatever. I have friends of mine who are still in the game and still doing it, and hats off to them that do. But a lot of people that were in my generation have done really what I've done and moved to different directions. So that's the beauty of life. It evolves, and you go in different directions at different times.
And there were some points in the 90s when you left the BBC, you went solo. You did some films. One of them was Waiting for Harvey.
Yeah,
And
Harvey Weinstein. Ah,
what
no
was
less.
that like at the time you went to Cannes? You even wrote a book,
I
which
did.
I part read.
Yeah.
And
A long time ago now. Yes, I mean,
you were shooting as well with the
yes,
Cannes.
we were. We had a very big team actually down there. It was very good fun. We were doing, I can't remember. It's for a documentary team. It was big. It was about 26 people, and it was multiply funded by a number of companies, including the BBC. Um, and it was crazy, and it was a hoot at the same time. We basically followed four kind of unhinged filmmakers who are desperate to kind of go to Cannes and make their dreams come true. You know, maybe like some of your listeners, I don't know. Having said always, don't do it is my advice. You know, go be a lawyer instead. It was actually fantastically good fun. The crazy thing was we had two guys, I can't remember their names now, who'd made a film about they made this film about some kind of a drugs thing that was set in Amsterdam. It was called Amsterdam. It's to do with, you know, marijuana, and they had this kind of this yellow van, which was an old post office van. They painted it with a great big marijuana leaf on the side and decided to drive it with scripts that they had written. They hadn't made the film, they had scripts all the way to Cannes to try and kidnap Harvey Weinstein, who was then the big honcho in the movie business, and get him to commission their film. That was their plan. And they were deadly serious about it. They had three guys, had a bouncer, and two others who got in this van, and they kept getting stopped by the police the whole time, all the way down, because there's a great big marijuana leaf on the side of their van, and they kept getting stopped the whole time. And amazingly, they actually managed to get down to Cannes, where we then hooked up with other people and other people in my team. And I can remember it was 23 hours out of 24. It was really good fun, and there was one crazy guy that was making a film, and he turned a phone box. Then there were mobile phones, but he turned a phone box into an office, and he was trying to get his film projected in the Cannes film. And we went across the spectrum. One guy was actually in the competition, so had the full red carpet experience, which is an incredible thing to see, to be standing there in the middle of all of that. I mean, not as the centerpiece, I was simply filming it, but to be standing there in the middle of that mayhem and, let's just face it, kind of glamour. It's exciting, you know. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographers in black tie and dinner jackets and red carpets, and everybody's dressed to the nines. And you know, there's something. It's exciting. It was glamorous. It was fun to do. I enjoyed it. So it was a good. But Harvey Weinstein, I only saw him once. He spent most of the time outside in a hotel, which was incredibly difficult to get access to. We went there just once, but he wasn't there. And then he did come into a party that was given for one of the characters in the film, who had just signed a $3 or $4 million deal with Harvey Weinstein's young filmmaker, then in his early 30s, had made an absolutely terrible film called SLC Punk, about, can you believe, the punk rock scene in Salt Lake City in the 1980s. I mean, can you fucking believe it? That was the idea. Anyway, Harvey Weinstein picked it up, and I can remember him. This is really something I'll never forget. I can remember him coming into the movie, and I can remember when he came in, he was a huge guy, and everybody was terrified of him. And he had this sort of aura of fear around him. I can remember that. I'm not remembering in the light of future events. I can remember what I felt at the time. And I can remember he came in to this filled kind of Cannes party, and it was like the parting of the Red Sea as he came in, and people sort of moved aside like this as he kind of came in. And he could almost have had two kind of Italian bodyguards with him, you know, from the mafia. It had that kind of thing. But and he was standing at one point, I can remember, I wanted to film this at the time, but I didn't have my camera with me. But I can remember he was standing in the corner, eating nuts, peanuts. Maybe he was having a glass of wine or something, and nobody was talking to him. He was the loneliest man in the room. That's Harvey Weinstein.
God, now he's probably one of the loneliest men in prison with all this drama that's happened.
I guess. It's interesting because the film has been kind of picked up again, partly because of its name. And it only the other day, actually, a friend of mine who's a writer said he'd seen it. It's on somewhere, I can't remember where, but it became a bit of a cult film. And the book did too, actually. It's called King of Cannes, the book, and that also did, in that kind of world of sort of filmmakers, young, kind of thrusting, let's get all of that, in that sort of world. It sort of became, you know, and I've been, because several times I've had people, actually more than several times, who've mentioned it and have seen it. And that, I suppose it's sort of, there's kind of an energy in it, which is also part of me being younger at the time, obviously, that I think comes through.
Did you have a script in mind? Did you have a treatment? Was the story made in the cutting room?
No, it was, I did pitch, I remember first to the BBC. At the time, I just left the BBC, but I had very strong contacts there, and I did pitch it there first of all, and then from the BBC I went elsewhere. There was somebody else, actually a producer that I knew, again through connections, and she set me up with various different production companies, and one feature film company whose name I can't now remember, was quite a big one at the time, and they got money and they put it in, and so it kind of went that way around, and we just sort of put it together. Was it a bit? I always wrote a pitch. Always, for every project I do, I write a pitch, whatever it is.
How long's the pitch?
I will always write a 2-page, 3-page, 4-page document that is, this is my story, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm very, very precise with pitches, because you get a lot of pitches which are not precise and they're not very clear. And you've got to be really hot in your get. I've often wondered that I should set up a course at a film school, and teach how to pitch, basically, because I think a lot of people, I get endless emails with pitches on, endless. They come in constantly, and it is really interesting. It's very, very rare that you get something where you go, this is really well pitched, and it's a really difficult thing to get right. And it is, but it's essentially, you do get it right. A lot of it is to do with knowing your market. That's absolutely essential. You've got to know what people are looking for. You've got to kind of give them what they want, and then plus. That's really very hard to do. And then it's also being really clear about what the story is, how it's going to work, and not to be kind of crazily ambitious sometimes. It's not 15 parts about a village in Venezuela, unless you really know that this is going to change the world. And a sense of how you're also going to make it, what it's going to look like, a color, if you like, a tone. What is this? And sometimes referring to other projects that you know and love can be quite helpful for people to sense what it is that this thing is going to look like. So that's really important to do. And I get lots and lots and lots of these things. And really, I should think about that, because it's difficult to get it right, and most of the time people get it wrong, is the truth. You know, I'm sure I did too. I learned over years. I'm sure I haven't got it right yet, but I've kind of got a better idea just with experience, I suppose.
I'd recommend writing a book. Through the book, you get a reputation, and then, you know,
maybe that's
authors fielded.
Maybe that's the way to go. Maybe.
Brilliant. Okay. Tell me, what do you read a lot? What inspires you? And what do you think people want? You said you write for an audience. How do you know what the audience wants?
I don't, actually. It's a very good question. It's very, very, very difficult to know what the audience is, and particularly when it comes to writing. When it comes to books, I tend to write what interests me, and then let the book do its own business and see what happens. I spent many years, I was commissioned by Working Title Films to do a feature documentary, a cinematic documentary, about the race to put the first human being in space, Yuri Gagarin. And I went to Russia 4 or 5 times, and I started to access some incredible footage there. But then the whole Putin thing came down on us in a very big way, and we started having armed guards standing outside libraries, film libraries that we were sitting in, and basically making it very, very difficult for us to access the material that we wanted. And that was incredibly hard. And so I took all this material away. I'd done a lot of interviews. I thought, what can I do with this? I went to my book agent. I said, what about a book? There's an anniversary coming up. And then I wrote the book called Beyond, which came out a couple of years ago. And that did very well here, actually. And the thing about that is that I just turned all of that material that was sitting there in a drawer, that was just these priceless, in a way, interviews with people who were very much part of that Cold War period in '61 and this race to get to space and the incredible danger and drama and all that stuff, and Russia and America and Brezhnev, Khrushchev and Kennedy and all that stuff. And I just turned it into a book. So that wasn't me thinking about an audience. That was me thinking about something I really wanted to do. And as it turned out, the book was published in about 8 or 9, I think, different languages now. And certainly in the UK did well, and various other countries as well. So I just, whatever. But when I write those things, those history type books, I try to write them as thrillers. I mean, I write them as I mean, I'm doing one at the moment. I'm working on another one right now, which I can't tell you about. But it has the same kind of, it's kind of, it's like a thriller, but it's real.
It's like a John le Carré. cross with Montefiore, right, who wrote Young Stalin. Can I come back to you? Is it possible to zoom you in 10 minutes, just for another 10 minutes?
Yes, that's 12 minutes from now. Okay, if you send me another link, I'll come back to you at 12:20.
Will do.
All right, no problem.
Thank you. This podcast is kindly sponsored by Camera Museum of London at 44 Museum Street. Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch.